And we can start as well. Good afternoon or good morning, everybody, depending on where you are. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's book in the spotlight, in which we will hear Christina Shepardson and Philip Forness. Christina Shepardson is Distinguished Professor in the Humanities in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Tennessee, where she has been since 2003, first as an assistant professor and then as associate professor. Having trained in religious and biblical studies, she obtained her PhD in early Christianity at Duke in 2003. Her research interests are varied, but focus mostly on the history of early Christianity in the Mediterranean and address also Second Temple Judaism and anti-Semitism. Religious violence is a central theme in her research that emerged not only in the book that we will discuss today, but also in her previous works. And I will keep this brief. So among her many publications, I will only mention the two monographs, Controlling Contested Places, the Identique Antioch, and the Spatial Politics of Religious Controversy of 2019, and Anti-Judaism and Christian Orthodoxy, Ephraim's in 4th Century Syria, 2008. Our respondent today is Philip Forness. Philip Michael Forness is a BOF Associate Professor of Eastern Christianity in the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies at KU Leuven. Having studied classics and theology at Valparaiso University and Princeton, he obtained his PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary in 2016. Before coming to Leuven in 2022, he obtained postdoctoral positions at the Goethe University Frankfurt am Main. And currently is also the co-PI of the on a project on John of Ephesus ecclesiastical history based in Frankfurt. His research interests are also varied and focus mostly on Eastern Christianity and especially Syriac sermons, translations, and theological poetry, but also on biblical studies. Also in his case, among his many publications, I will only mention the two monographs on Jacob of Syriac, who was the author on which he wrote his PhD, that are Preaching Christology in the Roman Near East, 2018, and Jacob of Syriac, Homily on the Apostle Thomas and the Resurrection of our Lord, 2022. So today we will start first with a presentation of the book by Christina Shepardson. The book is Memory of Violence, and then a reply from Philip Forness will follow. So Tina, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Georgia, and thank you all so much for being here. I especially appreciate Georgia, Marion, Andy, and Dan who have organized this, and very much Phil Forness for agreeing to participate with me. I'm looking forward to the conversation with you all. And of course, I have to give a shout out to Luc van Rompuy, without whom my career, in fact, would not exist. So thank you to Luc, who was the co-dissertation advisor while I was at Duke. So I am always grateful to Luc for everything I learned and introducing me to the Syriac Christianity world. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to ask if I can share the PowerPoint slides, and I will just share a few slides that have background information. They have some names, some dates, so that while I'm talking, no matter what your current area of expertise is, it will be a little refresher in terms of what we're talking about. My plan is to give a overview of the chapters of the book in ways that I hope will help us see some of what I think of as some of the connecting themes and overall arguments that the book makes, and then hand it over to Phil in order to sort of drill down into some specific conversations. So I will do that sharing now and get this started. Okay. Everybody all right? Can see that? Okay, great. So as Georgia said, the book is A Memory of Violence and focuses on the century and a half really after the Council of Chalcedon in the 5th century. So I'm going to look for a minute with you at some of the controversies, but really I'm going to spend most of the time on the next slides. So this is just a quick reminder that after the 4th century material that my earlier books looked at, which is the Council of Nicaea, followed by in 325, followed by the First Council of Constantinople in 381. I think of the 4th century as sort of bookended by those two councils, which begin a conversation that is not resolved in the middle of the 4th century until the 381 council at the closer to the end of the 4th century. So for my third book, this monograph that just came out, I was interested in looking at the century after that, the 5th century councils. And those begin, of course, with the Council of Ephesus in 431. But when that divides the church, the sort of Roman imperial church, into the imperial church and what becomes the Assyrian Church of the East, that church is more flourishes more, as you know, in the Persian or Sasanian world. So since my expertise was very much in the Roman world, I wanted to stay in the Roman side, even if on the Persian border. So I ended up looking at the next series of councils, which starts with the councils leading up to the Council of Chalcedon. So this is just to show that there was a lot of imperial back and forth. I'm not going to go into the theological details, the doctrinal fights, but there's a council in 448 that decides one direction. The Council of 449 flips and decides the other direction and excommunicates the people who were running the first council. And then it flips back again in 451 and returns to saving, for example, Patriarch Flavian of Constantinople, and exiling, for example, Patriarch of Alexandria named Dioscorus. So the imperial orthodoxy is shifting back and forth in these years. And eventually, of course, the split that you see at the bottom, eventually this will mean that the church is divided among those who support the Council of Chalcedon and those who oppose the Council of Chalcedon, who we speak of, I will be speaking of as miaphysite Christians. So I was especially interested to trace how the Syriac language traditions that are in these miaphysite doctrinal communities, how did they support themselves as the legitimate, what arguments did they make to defend their legitimacy in the face of having lost this big imperial council in 451, because they survive till today. And so the question really was for me, and again, don't let this daunt you, just focus on colors, right? We're looking at the blue people versus the maroon people. So I was interested in tracing some of the authors in the Syriac language miaphysite traditions to see how did they deal with the ins and outs of this council, the having imperial support, losing imperial support, getting it back, and losing it again. In that case, it turned out forever. And so what I was looking at were the authors that are on your screen: John Rufus, Philoxenus of Marburg, Severus of Antioch, John of Tella, Zacharias Rhetor, also then Pseudo Zacharias, of course, and several other that aren't mentioned here, but also then, so those are in the late 5th and early 6th century. So there was a cluster of surviving materials from the late 5th, early 6th century. So that became one focus for my project. And then I wanted to look into the late 6th century, and John of Ephesus became my primary main source for that later period so I'm going to look through the table of contents of the book with you, just in order to get a sense of sort of the scope of the project. Okay, we'll come back to the map in a minute. Okay, so I begin. Of course, there's an introduction, but the chapter labeled Chapter 1 is Historical Foundations. And at first, this was part of the introduction, but I decided it needed to have its own chapter, in part because I found that a lot of the scholarship that's already on all of these sources and arguments tends to be a little more focused. I wanted my project to be a little bit wider in scope. And so as I was trying to sort of put together the networks of Northern Mesopotamia and the networks that began in Greek language but got translated into Syriac and retained, like Severus of Antioch, and trying to sort of track in time and space all of these different figures, it became clear to me that there wasn't the same amount of research on these networks and regional diversity as there was already on individual thinkers, or perhaps pairs of thinkers, or else following a doctrinal issue, regardless of who and where it's being talked about. So I decided this chapter needed to be on its own. So that's one thing. So that takes us then to this map, where one of the contributions, I hope, that of this chapter is really to highlight that in that late 5th, early 6th century period, we have sources on the Syriac Miaphysite tradition, both from the northern Mesopotamian region. You can see a cluster of around Edessa, right? Callinicum, Cyrus, Tella. But then we also have a cluster of sources who spent time, overlapping time, in fact, in and around Gaza and Mayuma in Roman Palestine. And for me, that was a really interesting aspect of seeing how those Greek miaphysite sources, some of them that came into the Syriac miaphysite tradition, had actually been authors in touch with each other who were in monastic communities together in this late fifth, early sixth century period. So then I move into genealogies. I have two chapters, one on genealogies of orthodoxy, one on genealogies of heresy. And the hope of those chapters is to look at how these late fifth, early sixth century authors are first making the argument after the Council of Chalcedon to say, we are Orthodox and I can prove it to you, even though the empire might not agree, I can prove it to you by tracing my orthodoxy, my doctrine, and tracing my ordination lineage back through all of the same greats of the past that everyone agrees are Orthodox. You know, all of the sort of martyr stories of the earlier church, the fourth century heroes of Athanasius and the Cappadocian fathers, Gregory, Basil, John Chrysostom. And so tracing that up through Cyril of Alexandria and into the contemporary period, they do the orthodoxy arguments for themselves. And then, of course, they link their opponents to genealogies of heresy to argue that they are not Orthodox. So this is a very sort of basic, like claiming ordination, claiming doctrinal commitments, but it became a really important foundation, the way I was understanding how these miaphysite church leaders are building an argument to say, in whether or not the empire agrees with us, I am going to prove to my church audience that we are undoubtedly the single Orthodox church community. So after that pair of chapters, the next chapters that I include are a series of 3 chapters that are thematic, and they look also at these same late 5th, early 6th century authors. So the same authors are sort of in all of these first chapters. So in these chapters, though, the thematic approach, I hope allowed me, in what I hope are constructive ways, to integrate more sort of violence, traditions of violence studies, memory studies. So I hope I'm contributing to the sort of field of Syriac studies a little bit of sort of new using methodology or literary theory, critical theory in ways that it is less commonly applied in Syriac studies. So in this case, thinking of how we talk about violence, how we talk about narratives of suffering, how we talk about narratives of persecution. And in that case, I found other scholars' work on violence really helpful in reminding us that claims to violence or claims to persecution are always a matter of perspective. And so when we hear somebody saying that person is violent, we know that the person speaking is trying to delegitimize the actor who's causing what they're calling violence, right? So it's not only a matter of historical fact or events, it also tells us about the perspective of the author. And so when we have in the past primarily heard the perspective of the 5th and 6th century through the imperial side or the Greek side or the Chalcedonian side, we don't hear these miaphysite Syriac stories as loudly. And I wanted to center those stories for this conversation. And then as we approach the end of the book, I wanted to take all of this work on the 5th and 6th century narrative strategies that these authors are using and ask, how do those thematic arguments also continue to show up in the later 6th century in a very much a different context in the writings of John of Ephesus? And so one thing that I learned that I had not anticipated from doing this work is how so much of the surviving earlier material is produced under the reign of Anastasius, Emperor Anastasius. And one thing that noticing that does is it changes the narratives of persecution that we are so familiar with from these materials. And if we realize that some of those narratives are also being produced while the miaphysite writers are in fact being supported by the empire. So we tend in our histories of this period, I think, to skip from 451 when the Council of Chalcedon ruled against the miaphysite doctrine, and we tend to sort of skip from there to the Justinian period, to the period of Justin's persecution starting in 518, the violence against miaphysite monasteries, bishops, priests that he started, and then especially the Justinianic period where we have John of Ephesus's eyewitness later recollections of that period. So when we skip over the decades of Zeno and Anastasius's imperial reign, what we accidentally do is overlook the fact that a lot of the surviving narratives are produced not under the threat of persecution, but in fact in an empire when the imperial orthodoxy accepts these narratives of miaphysite doctrine to some extent, different times, different places, it matters, but it's not a consistent narrative of persecution. And in fact, there's this period that I think is really productive for the survival of these Syriac miaphysite traditions, this period of imperial support. So the shift then to John of Ephesus when that support is gone, and then a last final conclusion chapter where I also had not anticipated initially including, where I look at what happens in the 50 years after John of Ephesus, the 50 to 100 years after. And it turns out that his writings are still, of course, being read today. So, of course, they are also still being read in the late 7th century. But in that context, they seem to be playing a useful role to the Christians who are first encountering the followers of Muhammad as the sort of the rise of Islam under Abd al-Malik, Caliph Abd al-Malik in the Umayyad period. So I was interested in how does that narrative continue forward into that time. Okay, so the last slide, just to sort of sum up my initial conversations so that we can move to discussion. The last slide is how do I see the book project contributing to several different layers of larger conversation. It's my hope, but I am waiting to see from book reviews and hearing conversation from people who've had time to read it. My hope is that, first of all, in the field of Syriac studies, it contributes or it encourages, I hope, the sort of larger integration of projects across different authors, across different contexts. And we have to do those single author projects, but once we have done them, can we also do more projects that start to integrate across time and across authors and across contexts? And part of what I hope part of what I found from doing that was, as I said, the importance of the reign of Anastasius, the significance of the place of Gaza in these early miaphysite conversations. The second thing is, I hope that this will be a productive use of different kinds of literary theory, the sort of violence studies I mentioned, memory studies that I mentioned. It's my hope that Syriac studies is now, I already see it, opening up methodologically into a much broader range of conversations. And I hope that this will be one more contribution to those increasingly diverse conversations. Second, it's my hope that the book also contributes to the broader study of late antiquity, not only in Syriac studies. And of course, the project is centering Syriac sources and centering miaphysite Christian voices. And so by definition, that will decenter some of the more traditional narratives that look at Latin and Greek traditions, imperial orthodoxy under the Chalcedonian model. And so and also by including the rise of Islam and going into some of the sort of borderlands of those two empires, it's my of the Sasanian and Roman empires. It's my hope also to continue to foster conversation across traditional disciplinary boundaries in that way. And very last is that beyond late antiquity, my broader hope is that maybe this can be a case study from a historical past that nevertheless helps us think about the current conversations as well. I learned a lot in reading violence studies, reading memory studies about claims to legitimacy, about moments of resistance and sort of community identity. And my hope is that having taken those conversations and looked at this early Christian material, that the case study of that early Christian material can also then contribute back to our understanding of violence and religion and forms of resistance today. So that sums up what I wanted to say. I'm going to exit the stop sharing here in just a second and come back to you and wake you up and invite Philip to start us off on a more interactive form of conversation. So thank you all for your attention. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Tina. It's really a great joy to have the opportunity to interact with your book. And I wanted to also thank the TeTra team for the invitation to be part of this. It's a really nice way to here at the end of the academic year to look forward to the summer and to some time of research. So very motivating for this. I had the chance to read your book as soon as I could when it arrived at our library last fall. So I was really happy to have a chance to come back to it this spring with a whole nother year of research under my belt and to revisit it for this conversation. For those who have not had a chance to read this book yet, A Memory of Violence is a very careful study of the main miaphysite authors and texts of the late 5th and the early 6th centuries, going throughout the whole 6th century, actually, as Tina's just presented. On my view, this very wide scope helps uncover many points of connection between the texts examined, and it gives readers insight, I think, into the traits of what miaphysite literature was at this time. Many of these traits were completely new to me, so there was much an experience of discovery while reading this, and others gave words to things that I had observed, especially in my work now in John of Ephesus, but I never had had the chance to describe or to put a name on them. So that was a really enjoyable part of the reading experience, was suddenly having the words to describe something that I had experienced by reading. Alongside a very close, careful reading of these texts, one is also invited, as Tina has just highlighted, to think theoretically. And I think this book models using theory productively, so making the best out of it, without overtaking the argument and without overshadowing the sources. So it's a very nice model of how to use theory. In short, I found this to be a theoretically informed monograph that is thoroughly grounded in the sources, and I can really recommend it to everyone to read. But my role today is simply to start the conversation about this book. Tina's already provided us with an overview of its chapters and contents, and I'll draw attention to simply two aspects of the book that stood out to me and raised a lot of questions for me. I'll begin each of them with an individual who's featured in some way in the monograph, and then I'll turn to the reflections that this inspired on the history of the miaphysite movement within the time period that's covered by the book. The first figure I'd like to highlight is actually one that wasn't in the presentation. It's Peter the Iberian. This is an author about whom John Rufus wrote, so an author who flourished in the early 6th century, writing in Greek, but whose works survive in Syriac. Peter the Iberian, as his name suggests, was born to a Georgian family, and he was raised for a time, at least in his very young youth, in Constantinople. But Peter became one of the leading figures in the anti-Chalcedonian movement in Palestine. His life attests to the often ignored role of the Georgian church in the history of miaphysitism. But Peter's influence was felt most strongly in Palestine, where he entered the monastery of Gerontius near Bethlehem, and later became bishop in Mayuma, so the port city of Gaza, quite close to Gaza City today. With the support of the Jerusalem bishopric for Chalcedon, Peter ended up fleeing to Egypt in 455, where he continued to teach against Chalcedon to the end of his life. Yet, and I found this interesting, really striking as I read your biography, he was buried, as you write, with great honor in his anti-Chalcedonian monastery in 491, back in Mayuma. Evidently, there were still enough anti-Chalcedonian sympathizers in Gaza at the end of the 5th century to enable this. The life of Peter the Iberian is told in the first chapter of A Memory of Violence, so this chapter that's trying to take us beyond individual authors and presents the corpus as a whole. And this broader view, found in this chapter represented by Peter, is one of the aspects I most appreciated about this book. That is, the seamless integration of Palestinian or Gazan authors and the Syriac miaphysite movement. We're fortunate today to have excellent studies of some of the major anti-Chalcedonian figures from or associated with Palestine and Gaza. You can think of books on Peter the Iberian and John Rufus here. We also have excellent studies of Syriac miaphysite authors such as Philoxenus. Yet the study of this early miaphysite movement is often fragmented, and the Palestinian and Gazan parts of this history often get lost in the mix, at least this is my impression. If we go back in the history of research on this field, we can think of a book like William Friend's The Rise of the Monophysite Movement. The conclusions of this book and also its assumptions are often criticized, and it's right that we would engage with it in a critical manner. Yet this book still represents one of the only attempts to really bring together all of the miaphysite movements in late antiquity into a joint history. Despite its shortcomings, there's really no replacement for this book yet. What is needed, at least in my view, is studies that show the connections between these communities, insofar as they existed, based on the close reading of texts. And I think your monograph, Tina, has done this in a strong way for the Palestinian and Syriac parts of the miaphysite movement. You emphasize links between authors connected to Palestine and the later Syriac miaphysite movement. We move seamlessly from John Rufus and Zacharias Rhetor, the real one, to Philoxenus and John of Tella, with figures like Severus of Antioch, who were in real life and who are also in this book a link between these communities. In this vein, I'd like to pose the first of my two questions. I'll go through my whole presentation, but just to keep this one to the side for the moment. What does it do to our concept of Syriac Christianity, or Syriac miaphysitism, to take seriously its connections with the Palestinian anti-Chalcedonian movement? Or to put it more sharply, did the Palestinian anti-Chalcedonian movement fundamentally shape what became Syriac miaphysitism, or eventually the Syriac Orthodox Church? So my first question is on this relationship between Palestinian and Syriac miaphysitism. The second aspect I wish to highlight focuses on the figure and works of John of Ephesus, so the focus of your chapter 7, also an author that I spend a lot of my life working on. In 571, Justin II issued an edict that formed one of the last efforts to bring about a lasting union between the Chalcedonians and the anti-Chalcedonians. This was a real effort. My colleague in Frankfurt, Silvio Rogo, refers to this as a union tantalizingly close, even as late as 571. Some miaphysites must have continued to hope that the Byzantine Empire would either support their position or find a solution for reconciliation. But Justin II's edict belongs to the last period where it made sense, at least when we look from our perspective, to have hope when one was a committed anti-Chalcedonian. The anti-Chalcedonians themselves were already split into different groups. We can think of two big ones, the Severans and the Julianists, and the debate over so-called tritheism would result in yet deeper divisions in the following decades. This is exactly the period, just before and just after 571, when John of Ephesus authored his two major works, The Lives of the Eastern Saints, and the first parts of the ecclesiastical history in the late 560s or early 570s, and then the third part of his ecclesiastical history stretching through the 570s and 580s. The late 560s are also the time when pseudo-Zechariah Rhetor, not the real one, completed his compilation known as the Ecclesiastical History, or commonly as the Chronicle. The final chapter of your monograph turns our attention to how John of Ephesus inherits and utilizes many of the strategies of remembrance found in miaphysite works of the 5th and 6th centuries, tracing genealogies of saints in heresy, the memorialization and reinterpretation of suffering, the claim to seeing prophecies that were being fulfilled, especially negative prophecies, and discourse around ritual practice, especially participation in communion. Some of the source materials you highlight from this earlier period are also, just like John's work, narratives. John Rufus's lives, the lives of Severus from the middle of the 6th century, and so forth. But many are also doctrinal treatises, letters, and homilies. It stood out to me that somehow these strategies of memory cross genres and could be codified in a narrative form in John of Ephesus's works. And this was, I think, one of the experience of delight I had reading your book, spending so much time with John of Ephesus and suddenly seeing him as part of a continuum. That was really a wonderful aspect. So my question revolves around the potential importance of narrative, especially on the magnitude of John of Ephesus's two major works. Alongside these narrative works, we also have different types of project from the later 6th century in the anti-Chalcedonian movement. The production of new florilegia, so the anti-Julianist florilegium, treatises like Peter of Callinicum's Against Damian, which reads something like a commentary on the florilegium, and collections of works such as the Documento Monophysitica. So my second question is, what role did narrative play in communicating strategies of remembrance to future generations of miaphysites in comparison to other genres? So the first question, Palestinian and Syriac miaphysitism, and the second, the role of narrative. So thanks so much again for the chance to read your book, to re-engage with it, and to enter into conversation.
Thank you so much, Phil. That was really, really generous and beautiful. And thank you for contextualizing it so well in light of a larger history of scholarship on these materials, including your own, which has been so helpful to me in my own work. I will, why don't we go back and start with your first question and talk a little, and then maybe attack your second question after that. So the first question I appreciate about the role that Roman Palestinian communities played in this history of what we today think of as the Syriac and Syrian and Northern Mesopotamian churches. So I think that was a real surprise to me when I was doing the research. I was initially, like I assume most people do, working with the texts and sometimes paying attention to the date, of course, when I needed to sort of figure out what was first and what was later. But it really was the fact that my second monograph was all about space, place. It was like the sort of interest in looking at the role that particular places and their reshaping played in the history of the church in the 4th century Antioch in that case. At some point, I thought, I can't believe I've come this far in the project and not put these places on a map. Like I need to spatialize my project, even though that isn't my current focus. It's if I learned anything from that second book I did, it was how important paying attention to place can be. And so in that case, it was through that I really tried to track down the Gaza connections as well as I could with existing scholarship, which has been incredibly helpful. All of the work, of course, that you know also, the sort of Broria Bitnash Koloni and Aryakovsky and all of the work on Gaza, the Gazan community in this period. So I think it wasn't something I knew going in, but as I started to pin down who was where, when, and writing from where, it really was a surprise to me, not only to see that several of the sources I was using had a Gazan provenance, but also that even more of the people had a Gazan connection. And so I think Severus was the larger surprise to me. I mean, Zacharias I knew was from the region, even though he's writing from elsewhere. So I hadn't really made that a key point of my writing about him. But it was Severus that really helped me think this through in this way that I ended up writing about, because I had come to think of him as, I mean, I don't know how similar this is to everyone. I assume it's similar, right? We think of him as associated with Antioch and we think of him as associated with Egypt for very good reason. That is the sort of base of his power is he comes to be Patriarch of Antioch and then he lives for a long time in exile in Egypt where he remains very powerful. So it was his earlier years in the Gazan monastic community or ascetic communities that I had known much less about. And so when I realized that he had in fact been in the same monastery, right, the Peter of the Iberian monastery, where John Rufus was a priest and in charge for a bit, and also where Zacharias was from, and that these folks were writing lives of each other in some cases, knew people in common as a third person in the middle who connected them. And so it was then that I realized that not only the location, but also the language of these writings was an important part of this story. So what we think of as what becomes the later Syriac tradition in fact does inherit not only a Gazan has a Gazan piece to its history, but that means it also has a Greek piece to this history. And I think the history of Greek miaphysitism in the late fifth century to early sixth century is not one that I have seen a lot of scholarship about for obvious reason. It gets taken into the Coptic tradition, get taken into the Syrian tradition. So these Greek authors, they remind us that the conversations are multilingual already in this period, and that it is the later history that shapes how we think about that early history. So to answer your very specific question about the impact or influence, I do think that because of Severus in particular, it's hard to imagine modern day or even late sixth century Syrian Orthodoxy when we start calling it that without the influence of Severus. And I've now become convinced that it's hard to imagine Severus having precisely the doctrinal and ascetic positions that he holds without taking account of the more than 10 years, the impact that those 10 plus years had on him when he was in that Gaza Mayuma Palestinian community. So in that one thread, I would say, yes, because Severus has such an enormous impact on Syrian Orthodoxy and because the ascetic and doctrinal conversations happening in Gaza and Mayuma in the period he was there impacted how he thinks and practices. In that thread, I would say, yes, it has an important, a significant impact. Could it have existed without Severus? Yes, but it would not be the same thing. And without Antioch Severus, without Gaza, Severus would not be the person he came to be. So through that tracing, I do think it has an as yet not fully recognized or acknowledged part of that history. So I don't know if you want to talk any further about that before.
Yeah, sure. I can say something. Thank you so much. That's really helpful to see how you thought through that and how you also came to it because it comes across very clearly in the book. And I was thinking about this connection in relation to your book and then a dissertation that was defended in January here in Leuven. In your book, it came across that there's such continuity in the types of argument, the strategies of remembrance, or all of the different traits that you highlight in chapters 3 to 6. Four to six, as well as the genealogies in 2 and 3. That miaphysite literature itself is being shaped in this period, and also by these authors with a connection to Gaza. And then this goes forward in the Syriac tradition. And I never had been aware of this before. The others was the dissertation was on John Rufus and Cyril Scythopoulos as hagiographers and how they conceived of the Holy Land. And there's a very interesting aspect of John Rufus where he contrasts with Cyril in their perspective on the Holy Land because it was a land of exile for the Miaphysites. And so this idea of exile then getting, I wonder, it was a curiosity, getting taken up into later literature where you almost have this incubation period of a movement and then it continues on. You have a really nice line here somehow that even though the Miaphysites didn't continue in Gaza or in Roman Palestine for a very long time, that their ideas still had an afterlife. So anyway, it's something I really enjoyed in the book. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think that afterlife of those narratives, and I will say, of course, this is just like I have told one story from these sources, but my hope is that by showing the way that you can tell such like interesting, compelling stories by placing them side by side and integrating them, I hope that now others will also continue to tell different stories. There's certainly other stories to tell with this vast body of material. There are theological stories and the sort of Coptic Egyptian side and the internal divides among the miaphysite communities. There are whole huge book length things that I set aside in order to be able to focus on a publishable length book project. But I think the afterlives are exactly, to get to your second question more quickly, exactly what the second question you asked talks about, which is once we see some of these patterns in the writings from the earlier miaphysite community, we see them continued. We see the threads pulled up and pulled together and woven into John of Ephesus's story. So yes, I agree with you completely. All of the late 6th century material should be part of a much longer other conversation other than the ones that I was having. The chapter on John of Ephesus, which he turned out to be the end of my story instead of what I thought he was going to be was the beginning. But it turned out what I was interested in was going back and seeing what produced him more than what else he was engaged with in his own world. But there's so much more to do. And I think that the sort of liturgical materials that you mentioned, some of the documenta that are sort of in the liturgical tradition, also the internal splits that you mentioned within the Miaphysite community, the Severans and the Julianists and the Tritheist controversy, like all of these are really important parts of how the traditions continue to develop. But what I agree with your question, the narratives that I chose to focus on have this quality that for me, the type of history, the type of historian that that I seem drawn to is largely narrative focused. And so that's what led me to the project as I chose to shape it. Um, I think I think that my particular sort of interests and questions and skills are more geared towards reading out of narratives, community identity construction, and ideological sort of focus, and those questions that I find especially motivating. But there is so much more work to do with all of those late 6th century, because as you point out, John of Ephesus is not the end of, he's the end of my short story, but he's also the beginning of such a huge later story. And in that respect, doing something like I did for the late 5th, early 6th century folks in pulling all of the materials together and talking about an integrated story going forward, you could do that whole project on its own again with that late 6th century material moving forward. So yes, I completely agree. For me, the narrative sources proved to be particularly fruitful for the kinds of conversations I was having, but there is so much more to do with all of these rich sources. So and I want to thank you for those observations and questions.
Thanks. Just one final comment from my side on John of Ephesus. You point out in the appendix or the conclusion, I guess, Apocalypse now, that the same time that we're getting these works of Apocalypse, this is also the time period in which John of Ephesus's works are copied. So both his lives and his ecclesiastical history largely survive in manuscripts from probably late 7th century. It's hard to say exactly for the ecclesiastical history. And what really struck me was how much John is, he's such a good endpoint to your story because he brings together all of these things and it's almost a new phase. But what also struck me, as you're pointing to this in the 7th century, this manuscript, is that John was, it's hard to argue from an absence of evidence, but he doesn't seem to have been a very popular author. We have the one manuscript, and then we have the one that Georgia has worked on from a later century with 3 chapters taken from the 6th book. But then when Michael the Syrian uses him, he becomes a standard narrative. And Michael rewrites him and makes him more comprehensible. He really becomes part of this narrative. So it just made me think about John being reflective of all of these different types of authors at that time. him with both hagiography and with ecclesiastical history, inheriting these the yeah, these strategies of remembrance, these different narrative strategies that you highlight, and bringing them into the category of narrative. And I think in other ways we could see a florilegium as reflecting these and these other types of works. So yeah, it's part of this broader concept, and I think it's a wonderful place to end in your story.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tina, for this rich and illuminating discussion of your book and for drawing out for us the connecting themes of your work and their larger implications. And thank you to Philip Forness for your thoughtful response and for starting the conversation for us. It is now, after having heard from our two excellent speakers, it's now my pleasure to open the floor for questions and reactions from anyone who is present here today. Please feel free to use the reactions button on Zoom to raise your hand virtually or to write in the chat. We can also read out questions for you if necessary, or maybe even to raise your hand in a physical way. If that's helpful, we look forward to hearing from our audience as well. And Georgia, could I give the first follow-up question to you, please?
Yes, if there's no one else, I can break the ice for the rest of the audience. Thank you so much, both to Tina and to Philip, for starting the conversation, and also for giving me the hint to link it with my own research, because what struck me so much one of the things that struck me so much while reading your book is that the strategies that you highlighted in analyzing continuous narratives, analyzing text, analyzing authors, are the very same that I found while analyzing historiographical excerpt collections. The places that you put on the map are the same places that are quoted in excerpt collections, both from the 6th and later in the 8th century. And of course, one can argue that those are the places that are mentioned by Socrates and Theodoret in the ecclesiastical history that they write. But whoever put the collection together made a selection. So they decided to still, those places must have had an importance also later on, even if probably it would be very hard for us to have a very coherent narrative as to why exactly that place is mentioned in that excerpt collection. But those are the places that are mentioned. And also the strategies, we didn't have enough time so far to talk about the strategies that you highlighted, but that of creating genealogies of heresies and genealogy of orthodoxy are the very same that I found myself. And the interesting thing that you also mentioned in your book is that those are the same strategies that are used by also the opposing party, the Chalcedonian party. So I guess that what I wanted to discuss and to start thinking about together is whether in your research you did find one particular strategy or something that is peculiar to the Syriac miaphysite tradition, also in connection to one of the things that you point out, that is that not only do miaphysite as a group come and get in and out of power, but also the people that write, as you yourself mentioned, get in and out of power while they write. So they change strategies. So yeah, I guess that is one of the things that for me remains one of the questions that I would like to discuss more. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Georgia. That's great. Yeah, and your own the essay that I cited from you, it was towards the end of the work I was doing. Luke pointed me towards the article that you had written that I quoted, and it was so helpful to see that you all also had come to some of the same. Your work overlapped so nicely with the work that I was in the process of finishing. So I'm not surprised to hear you say that you've continued to find similar things. I would say one of the things that I've noticed is the Chalcedonian Christians that I have looked at, so this is a tentative hypothesis and not a guaranteed solution, do not seem to take up the narratives of martyrdom, persecution, and suffering in the same extent that the miaphysite Christians do. And it's hard to know chicken and egg, like which comes first, whether it's because it's what survives now from all of the things that were written, or if it's because they had different approaches, and then why did they have those different approaches. So I would just observe that I did a short essay that let me focus on this just much more recently after the book was finished. And it showed me a few clear examples where the miaphysite sources that I'm looking at in this book very explicitly, given the opportunity, start calling bishops martyrs, whether or not they've died, right? Like, or when they die, whether or not they died from what we might call imperial aggression against them because of their doctrinal commitments. They might die in exile from old age, but they die in exile, therefore they can be called a martyr. But Proterius of Alexandria and is one counterexample where there are some traditions later that he is a hero martyr, but the early sources about the Chalcedonian bishop of Alexandria getting kicked out and then brought back and then killed, they don't highlight him immediately as a martyr. They talk about how terrible the miaphysites are. They talk about how great he was, but they don't use the martyrial language to the same extent that the miaphysite Christians seem anxious to jump onto it. So that's one thing I would explore. And then the other has to do not with the genre remains the same, but the details, of course, will be different. So after Cyril of Alexandria, which figures get included, whether it's Flavian or Dioscorus, whether it's, Severus or the Chalcedonian side, like who gets included in the traditions then becomes the distinction. And so then you have the question of, was the wrong name said? Was was the other side's name read in the diptych in the liturgy? And of course, Volker Menze's work on that is very helpful. So those are some things that come to mind, but I agree with you that part of what I was doing was in fact tracking how the church that loses does exactly the same things that the churches have always done, except that we tend to think of post-Constantine as the end to those second, third century strategies. And what I was interested in showing was that because we have churches now in the 5th century, both the Church of the East and all of the Miaphysite communities that survive after losing an imperial council, we can continue to see how all of these communities are not stopping post-Eusebius and post-Constantine the same like strategies that they used in the beginning. They continue to use those and to build on the 4th century traditions that they carry forward.
Thank you. We do have a little bit of time left for further questions and comments. Andy, did I see your hand? Yes, please.
Thank you very much. I unfortunately have to admit that I haven't yet read your book, so this is going to be more of a question out of ignorance and just out of interest. So maybe two questions which are sort of related. One is in this theme of violence. One related issue that didn't come up is war. Is it ever categorized in this way, sort of, and linking it then also to the political? And certainly if they're writing in the time of Anastasius. And then secondly, I don't know, for example, in the Armenian context, the example that is always used are the Maccabees. So are there these kind of examples that you also address in the book? Is it the biblical examples or earlier hagiographical ones? That kind of thing.
Yeah, thank you. Wonderful. So yes, one of the things that I try to show in the project is the way in which some of these authors, John of Ephesus becomes my my greatest example, but I tried to argue he's doing related things that the earlier authors are also often doing, and that is to combine a lot of different types of suffering together in order to show the church as a church that is suffering, and therefore a church that is righteous because they are suffering for God. And so war gets brought in, plague gets brought in, natural disasters in our language get brought in alongside doctrinal conflicts, exile. So that was one of the ways that I ended up shaping the conversation about violence in the book, is to argue that, yes, exactly as you say, that the argument that I was making is that the argument these leaders are making is that everyone is experiencing suffering, but sometimes it's from famine, sometimes it's from Sasanian attacks, sometimes it's from the bubonic plague, and sometimes it's from doctrinal controversy, from imperial sort of persecution. So by combining those all together and highlighting a narrative of suffering as a sign of devotion, you draw in a much larger audience than if you only highlight the individuals who have suffered at the hands of the imperial government for doctrinal reasons.
Can I maybe just catch on to this? And just out of curiosity, does that then suggest some kind of more monastic audience in the sense of suffering, sort of suffering for the faith, or does it in actuality also cover a wider audience than that?
Yeah, there are so many. That's a great question. I think there are so many interesting things to say about that. First of all, I think one thing that I took away that I don't think it occurred to me so late in the writing that I'm not sure it came across clearly when I went back and tried to add it in. But I actually think that one reason we have from Friend, who Phil mentioned earlier, this narrative of the key role that monasteries played in preserving the miaphysite tradition is not only because indeed local monastic communities did play a key role in preserving it, but also because the language monasticizes the laity as well, in that they are arguing for a suffering form of Christianity, which gives up luxury, which gives up sort of position or title in order to retain your devotion to the miaphysite church when they're out of power. And so therefore, it's not only that monasteries are key, but it's also that the language of ascetic denial, self-denial, or self-abnegation is key to the community's identity that's being produced, including for church congregations writ large. That was something that I came to believe by the end of the writing of the book.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And if there are no further questions, I propose that we thank our two wonderful speakers, Tina Shepardson and Phil Forness.
Thank you all so much for being here and for the opportunity to have this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you, Philip. Thank you, everybody. See you next time.